And next we have Jared Rothstein from Daytona State College speaking about the enticingly titled topic, Surfing, Sharks, and the Limits of Reason.
Thank you. I want to start by adding to the chorus of love for Bob. Like Kareem described, I took Bob my last semester of coursework, and it was also a lifesaver for me. Exclusivism has been a big problem in philosophy, forget anthropology. And Bob sort of opened up the avenue for me, and I was also like a surrogate father figure, and his kindness, generosity, and support just meant the world to me. And this is doubly special because I have an equally fond place in my heart for the CMBC. I had the privilege of being the second graduate assistant in the second year and beyond. And it was such a treat to work with Bob and Laura, the dynamic duo. And I'm so gratified to see how much it's thrived as it should. So I'm in the process of writing a book currently, and I greatly welcome this opportunity because it's still a work in progress. So I welcome your feedback at the end. I've published the first 3 chapters as standalone articles. And today I'm basically going to be going over the first chapter, and then I will step back and talk about some of the more global implications as I see them with respect to the whole project. So before Bob saved me, I originally came to this philosophy program at Emory, like many others, to study continental philosophy and existentialism in particular. My favorite was Nietzsche. This nicely captures his ethos. He says the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and enjoyment is to live dangerously. While I love Nietzsche, I never lived out his mantra until I moved to Daytona Beach, Florida. I've generally been a very risk-averse person in multiple facets of life. I don't like highway driving. I didn't like any comparable winter sports. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. So skating, skiing was not my thing. But lo and behold, I've adopted a Nietzschean approach. Unbeknownst to me, this is my fancy graphic. Unbeknownst to me, when I started this surfing odyssey about 7 years ago, it's a miracle I survived originally. Now, looking back, I was so naive as to the risks and the dangers. I learned subsequently that where I surf is the shark bite capital of the world. So there's an annual average, as you see, 32 attacks in this one little county. In 2019, a third of attacks were in Volusia County, and half of the worldwide cases were surfing related. So this is a particular risk for surfers insofar as we occupy the same spot. So where the waves break is where there's the most rich biota. And so that's what attracts the sharks. And flailing and falling and wiping out is a signal for them to attack. So just to give you a little representation of the dangers, let me show you this clip very quickly if I can get it up. So this happened a month ago, literally less than a mile from me.
A 38-year-old man bitten in the face by a shark this morning has been released from the hospital.
This happened just before 8 o'clock this morning as the victim from South Carolina was surfing in New Smyrna Beach.
West 2's Claire Metz is there live. And so, Claire, do we know he's okay?
Well, Nancy, he was taken to Halifax Health Medical Center, which is our trauma center, taken there as a precaution. That he's already been released, we have to assume is a good sign. We have not been able to reach him yet. Now, his shark encounter was at the inlet, which is where the majority of shark bites here in Volusia County occur.
As we were walking out this morning, we saw 4 or 5 small spinners ourselves.
Longtime surfer Ron Robinson got to the jetty shortly after the victim was bit, saw him being transported, and learned he'd been bitten on the right side of his cheek between his ear and his eye after riding a wave and coming off the board.
9 out of 10 times it's because they'll fall in the shallow water and spook the shark, and it's a reaction bite.
Chopper 2 flew the area earlier, recording several sharks in the water near the jetty. And, of course, plenty of surfers, too. The jetty boasts some of the best waves in the southeast and a buffet of bait fish that sharks feed on. The experts have long said a bite is usually a case of mistaken identity, and the locals agree.
I think if you bump them or you just happen to wave your foot right in front of their face, they'll go for it thinking it's a fish.
Typically, shark bites here are not life-threatening, and there haven't been any fatalities as far back as anyone can remember. Still, coming face-to-face with a shark, as apparently happened in this case, is unnerving. We've yet to interview a surfer, though, who doesn't say the reward is worth the risk.
That's like saying there's bad drivers on I-4. We know they're out there, right? The sharks are out there. It's their backyard. Just try not to fall on them.
I drive I-4 too to get over here, so it's a greater risk there.
Maybe, but cars don't have big sharp teeth and the fishy reputation sharks have. Today's bite, the 7th shark bite in Volusia County so far this year. And we typically average between 5 and 10 shark bites in a year, though I do recall one year, 2001, when we recorded 22 shark bites. Now, hopefully we won't see any more anytime soon, but we are going to see a lot of surfers in this water as Hurricane Lee brings in those big swells the surfers love. We're live in New Smyrna Beach, Volusia County. Claire Metz, West.
So, not my finest picture, I apologize. But basically, in addition to the shark dangers, this is an extreme sport. These are some of my most noteworthy injuries among many. The one is a broken nose, a reconstructed wrist. I've broken ribs. I've had an eye contusion, broken toes, broken fingers, usually from being slammed by a big wave onto the board or the ocean bottom. And actually the biggest risk pertaining to surfing is accidental drowning. So a month ago, a surfer died near my house, and there's endless stories in this area. This was my ethnographic research into the surfer culture of Florida. But basically, one thing you should never do is surf alone due to a variety of factors. I do this daily. And as I progress in the sport, the goal is to basically go bigger, surf larger waves, more artistically. And it's sort of this endless drive. So what used to satisfy me 7 years ago no longer gives me that rush, unfortunately. And the only flotation device that surfers have is their own board, and we're connected to the board by a rubberized leash. And unfortunately, these leashes snap. I've had 7 snap twice in hurricane conditions where I nearly drowned. So you're probably wondering, as I ask myself many times, am I crazy? So this paper was very personal. This is something I've asked myself repeatedly. My family members and loved ones have urged me to stop with this insanity. Franz Duvall, who I also had the privilege of working with on my dissertation on the evolution of morality, gave me comparable advice. But as I thought about this more deeply, I realized that this is really just a subset of a broader range of issues pertaining to future discounting. And like the surfers mentioned in the clip I showed you, they're all very well aware of the risk, but they've basically assessed that the reward justifies the cost. So this got me thinking about future discounting. This was my mom's mantra. this was on our refrigerator door. She wrote this on my high school yearbook. And it's basically a testament to future discounting, right? And we have other colloquialisms, right? One in the hand's better than two in the bush, pertaining to the potential rationality of future discounting in certain circumstances. So generally speaking, a future discounting dilemma is any situation where there's an apparent conflict between an immediate reward and a potentially better long-term one. This is a ubiquitous sort of dilemma across multiple domains. So some of you last night might have been wondering, should I have that next drink? Seems like it's going to be wonderful now, but I may pay the price tomorrow, right? Economically, this is a constant issue, right? Should you splurge or save your money for a rainy day? So the traditional view, that's the main man, Plato, supposedly. The traditional rationalist view in economics and philosophy is that the rational choice is always to delay gratification. And this conception was largely based on an outmoded, bifurcated view of the mind, where there was an artificial divide between cold processing and hot affect. And according to this ideal, we should have cold reasoning, completely devoid of emotional input. We know from the likes of Damasio, right, when ventromedial prefrontal cortex patients who don't have emotional input in their decision making, that this is a pathological state such that people can no longer make decisions. So I think this was part of what led them astray. A great corrective comes from behavioral economics, right? So in contrast to classic economics, which focused on how idealized agents ought to act, behavioral economics focused on what people actually do and make some normative recommendations on that basis. And the bottom line from behavioral economics is that, yes, we often discount the future. This was an evolved predisposition. And most importantly, this is not always irrational. And as I mentioned, my research originally focused on moral cognition. And there's a bevy of research indicating that emotionally laden decisions can, in fact, be normatively sound, right? So we have an aversion when we see an innocent person being smacked. And this is often an emotional, visceral response. And we believe that it ought to be there. And that's a normatively right judgment. So most people concur that when you discount the future, it's going to be a more emotionally laden decision. But that doesn't in and of itself render it irrational, is my contention. So Steven Pinker nicely characterizes this. Going for the quick reward instead of a distant payoff is often the rational strategy, right? Life is highly uncertain, and you run inherent risks anytime you defer gratification. Your interest could change over time. You might be dead before you can collect down the road. And of course, this was a greater pressure in our evolutionary past, where life was even more uncertain and dangerous and risky. So my contention is not that future discounting is always rational. We know many stories, and right, we have an obesity crisis, for example, in our culture, and impulsivity can often lead to bad outcomes. But I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all circumstance. So this got me thinking about, well, what is rationality, right? Because we often hear this, and in philosophy, there's been distinctions between rationality, reasonableness, and logical. I'm using the colloquial sense here interchangeably as synonyms. But the standard view in economics has been an optimization standard. And it says, given a set of options, individuals ought to choose that which would best fulfill their long-term interests. So the rational choice is the optimal one. this is empirically problematic. So as the founder of behavioral economics, one of them points out, the optimization problems that ordinary people confront are often too hard for them to solve or even come close to solving. So if we're a mirror unto ourselves, the glass is foggy, to say the least. Otherwise, Brian wouldn't have a job, and my mom, right, clinical psychologist, wouldn't be of great benefit if we always were fully transparent to ourselves. And of course, again, our interests can change. And so I think in general, this standard's too restrictive, and it's wrong to say that either you pick the optimal option, which you can often only assess in retrospect, looking back. Well, I wish I did this, or I'm glad I didn't. So I think it would make sense to speak more in terms of more or less reasonable choices or rational choices, as opposed to a zero-sum game where either you pick the optimal or you're irrational in your decision making. Irrespectively, the thing that really jumps out to me about this optimization standard is it's going to substantially vary based on the individual and the situation. So it's basically a bounded conception of rationality, where depending on the agent's distinctive values and interests, what's going to be optimal for one person may not be optimal for another. So because it might be reasonable for me to surf in the shark bite capital world, given my overriding love for the activity, that doesn't mean it would necessarily be reasonable for you. And right, people have different tastes and preferences. Some people need the excitement of a Nietzschean life. Others want to just chill out and have a more cautious, safe mode of living. And I think both are reasonable. We'll get into this later. I don't think that value adoption and preference is ultimately a rational, deductive process. So I think there's ample room for variability with respect to the preferences and priorities from one person to another. But as an important corrective to the rationalist view, in this sense, reason cannot provide universal prescriptions. There's not a one-size-fits-all program for individuals. And what really strikes me, and I've learned a lot about this through surfing, is that we can never have certitude regarding our future discounting judgments, given their inherently probabilistic nature. So you're basically always gambling. And I don't mean to suggest that all future discounting problems are equally challenging. Some are much more straightforward than others, but in other cases, it can be a very vexing question whether you should discount the future in this situation or not. And this has been strongly reinforced through my surfing practice. So really what makes for the pro surfers is great perception. So surfing is about wave selection largely. Waves are inherently unpredictable, and choosing the wrong one can literally be a life or death decision. And contrary to what you might think, surfing is largely a waiting game, whereby you're basically getting in position for set waves. So waves typically come in 3 to 4, and the interval between a set can be 10, 15 minutes. And so you're forced to make endless discounting choices. Do I go for the first wave? Often the first wave's not the cleanest, so it can lead to greater injury. There's been many occasions where I've gone, discounted the future, gone on the first wave because I'm impatient, only to look back over my shoulder and regret that I didn't wait for that next wave, which is even better. And of course, there's also the danger of being too selective, where I've waited and said, I'm going to take the last wave, and it turns out the last wave sucks, and I've just wasted another 10 minutes of paddling for no reason. So basically, this is the curse of counterfactual possibility. We can never really know what might have happened had we chosen otherwise. And so we're just basically gambling. Like I said, it's not an equally difficult gamble from case to case, but you're always betting on what might happen if you go for the immediate gratification, right? Should I go out and party tonight? Well, I might have the best time of my life. Or should I stay in and study? Well, maybe that wasn't the best choice either, but often these things can only be assessed in retrospect. So in other words, I don't think I'm crazy. I think given my particular predilections, surfing in the shark bite capital world is a reasonable choice for me. With respect to my broader project, this is sort of representative of what I'm emphasizing from chapter to chapter, that for a particular life issue or quandary of great significance, reason can't conclusively resolve the question. So this came up a bit in Brian's talk regarding Pollyannas and pessimists. My mom's a consummate Pollyanna. I'm a pessimist. I lost the cortical lottery. And we're very similar in other respects. So this got me to think about, well, can reason really dictate how optimistic or pessimistic a person should be? I think there's ample room for divergence in that respect, since, depends on what you attend to. There's enough crap in life that you could be a cynic if you want to focus on that. And there's enough positive developments that you can be a Pollyanna-ish person as well. In my third chapter, I address another issue, especially in ethics. So the traditional view among ethicists is that acting selfishly is inherently unethical. That's the Kantian position. He wants you to act for duty's sake and duty's sake alone. I basically, in that chapter, focus on evolutionary psychology, which I think has been a little misrepresented. So, for example, the standard line in evolutionary biology, Franz talks about this in his perception action model of empathy, is that while our motivations can be proximately altruistic, from an ultimate perspective, it's going to be a selfish choice in this reciprocal altruism, kin selection and such. But I think the main thrust of evolutionary psychology is pointing out that at the proximate level, it's much more complicated. Our motivations are often mixed, right? And characteristically, altruistic acts often bring benefit to the individual who performs them. Again, through reciprocal altruism, I do a good turn to you, you're more inclined to do one to me. We have the phenomena of virtue signaling, right? And if you're on social media, this is a common phenomenon. Well, why do people virtue signal? Because it conveys benefits quite often. And so generally speaking, I think it's a much muddier picture than philosophers have typically countenanced. And irrespectively, it's another example, I think, whereby reason cannot definitively settle how much you should sacrifice for the people you love. My mom's a thoroughgoing egoist. My dad's a Kantian who thinks duty is primarily to others. And so I've had these dueling specters my whole life. The traditional critique from my ex-girlfriends is that I'm selfish, right? And I think I'm self-aware insofar as I know my priorities and interests, and I'm not necessarily willing to sacrifice them. But bottom line is I consider both my parents reasonable people, and they have vastly different perspectives regarding how much self-sacrifice we should be making for the people we love. With respect to the broader implications of this naturalistic approach to reasoning, I think it largely verifies ancient wisdom. So Aristotle famously argued that virtue is the middle way, striking the golden mean, that perfect balance between extremes. So you can be, with respect to bravery, right, not brave enough, a coward, but you can also be too brave. And for him, basically, you can always have too much of a good thing, which we don't often acknowledge when it comes to morality, which is quite interesting. But his main emphasis was that balance is, again, going to be individually and situationally variable. So what might be the right balance for one person is not necessarily going to be the right balance for another. And that there's going to be situational divergence as well. So what does the particular situation call for? And notably, the founder of classical logic was very much aware of the limitations with respect to practical decision making. So Aristotle argued that practical wisdom is predicated on phronesis, not formal logic. Phronesis is basically perceptual discernment, the ability to see a circumstance and know the salient features and act accordingly. And much of the research on decision making, whether it's moral or otherwise, indicates that perceptual frames are generally the driving force. So once we categorize a circumstance in a certain way, this triggers an evolved predisposition and we act accordingly. So in large measure, Aristotle stands up well in light of this contemporary research. Moreover, I think Socrates was really onto something, right? In contrast to his student Plato, who thought he figured everything out and was going to do us the great service of sharing his insights regarding the metaphysical origins of the universe pertaining to the forms, which many people consider fantastical creations. Socrates, his teacher, was a thoroughgoing skeptic, right? And Socrates famously said that wisdom pertains to knowing what you don't know. And the number one virtue to be cultivated in this respect was intellectual humility. So, with respect to the art and science of rationality, I don't mean to demean reason. I think it has great instrumental value and is certainly helpful as a fact-finding tool. But generally speaking, I think much of the science pertaining to rationality points to its limitations with respect to some of these big life questions and debates and how to resolve them. So I think the art of rationality is learning how to live with uncertainty, doubt, and tolerance of dissenting views. And this is certainly something that's kind of struck home to me, that reasonable people can have vastly different conclusions when it comes to morality, politics, and existential attitudes, right? We live in a society rife with political and moral disagreement and strife and polarization. And the most common refrain I hear is when someone disagrees with a particular position, we tend to frame the opposition as not only immoral, but irrational as well. And I think those two notions have to be teased apart a little bit, and that reasonable people absolutely can have diverging conclusions with respect to a lot of these questions. All right? Questions?
Can you tell us a little bit, if you know, about factors that contribute to future discounting? I'm thinking of, I don't know if you know any of this literature and life history theory. But it seems that that bears on the question of future discounting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know a ton. Certainly impulsivity as a general personality trait is going to be a contributing factor.
Yeah.
And definitely the emphasis has been on external factors like greater uncertainty and risk in your environment. That's going to be more conducive as well in all likelihood.
Yeah, I
But-
think that's the big takeaway. It's unstable, unpredictable environments increase future discounting. What about, do you know anything about, like, I don't know anything about this really, especially cross-cultural differences in future
Mhm.
discounting?
Yeah, I don't know in particular, but I assume it would be again relevant insofar as, I'd assume cultures and with greater strife and difficulties and uncertainty, I presume those individuals may be more likely
Yeah, I
to.
guess we could consider Daytona cross-cultural.
It most certainly is. I never thought I'd be living in the heart of NASCAR, and our other big cultural event is Bike Week. Bike Week, it's basically like Sturgis, but a slightly smaller. So yes, lots of ethnographic opportunities.
Thanks, Jared. That was great. So I was really sort of I caught on to one of the last remarks you said, which is reasonable people can disagree and they're not unreasonable for that. But you didn't go so far as to say one of them wouldn't be immoral. And so I was just sort of hoping to hear a little bit more about what you see as the interaction between rationality and morality. But I was also just, this is maybe a more general question, which is just what does irrationality look like on your view?
Yeah.
Because it seems like you've got a pretty capacious notion of rationality.
Yeah. So with respect to your last point, rationality is going to be individually bounded. So we can assess whether a choice is reasonable or not to the degree that it conduces to the satisfaction of that individual's preferences and values. And I definitely do want to separate morality from reasonableness. And I think, yes, with regard to political divergence, absolutely, you can characterize that as a moral failing. But I just think framing it as a rational one is probably a little infelicitous, at least, and not that helpful. I do worry that like I said, is a work in progress, that my conception may be a little too permissive. And I think about actually Bob's longtime friend, Mark Johnson, wrote this outstanding, one of the best books in this realm on moral imagination. And he really focuses on how important imaginative understanding is in contrast to like deductive reasoning. And I think this again pertains to the importance of perceptual frames in driving our judgment. And that's something I've been wrestling with myself. To what degree are competing perceptual frames rationally dictated? And obviously I don't want to get too into this, but reasonable people can disagree about the Israeli-Palestine situation. For me, it's a clear red line when we have terrorist targeting of civilians, right? That's a clear moral line. And we've seen protests throughout America and the world basically defending what I consider the indefensible. And it worries me that I may not be able to condemn that sort of move as irrational. In a sense, I do think it's irrational. And it's been interesting to listen to interviews of the people defending the terrorist act, right? And there's been versions of Holocaust denial, right? Saying, oh, these atrocities didn't really happen. So it's fascinating how people can justify these different perceptual frames. And like David Hume basically said, reason has an instrumental role to play with respect to morality and also fact finding. So I'm curious about the degree to which fact finding can perhaps be a linchpin to make perceptual identification a rational process as opposed to a merely imaginative one. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question, returning to something that's less
heavy,
important.
Perfect.
Yeah. Which is cultural differences in discounting, because we did some work on that, and my late colleague Pierre did some studies in Kenya where people are sort of submitted to the sort of violence, warfare, etc.
Yeah.
And we had those charming interviews with a woman sort of who's given those things like, would you prefer 2 bags of rice in 2 weeks or 70 bags of rice in 2 years?
Yeah.
And she says, oh, 2 years, that means 4 or 5 incursions by the Sudanese army, at least one drought, probably 3 or 4 campaigns against our tribe by the other ones trying to kill all of us and stuff. So I stick with the now, the sort of 3 bags of rice now.
Yeah.
And I suppose the intensity of hyperbolic discounting is something that we don't realize because we have all sorts of institutions. In behavioral economics, people constantly tell you, yes, you'll have so many dollars in a year's time, which assumes that there are institutions there that guarantee that these things will actually happen, but they don't in most human existence. But I was also interested in this sort of notion that evolutionary psychology, in a way, sort of tends to favor a sort of view of deontological sort of interior norms as being mostly mutualistic, as opposed to reciprocal altruism, in the sense that they're mutualistic in the sense that because this partner choice, having a sort of moral profile that maximizes sort of deontological rules is a very good strategy, not necessarily for the individual, but for the propagation of that very disposition. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure I fully understand the last point. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
you lost me with the deontological.
Right. So basically the idea is that because of the evolution of cooperation, but by partner choice, the best profile to have in evolutionary terms is to be genuinely motivated by norms of fairness, which means that in many cases you may lose.
Right.
And reciprocal altruism is a very restricted form of that, in which you have a definite expectation of return on your investment in cooperation with others. In this sort of more partner choice, biological market vision, you don't. So what happens is that because the fairness profile is more adaptive, you have it, but it doesn't guarantee your welfare.
Yeah.
So that's just,
yeah. I think that dovetails nicely with just the uncertainty piece I'm referencing, right? And in that situation, there's even greater uncertainty when you don't have the reliable norms of fairness upon which to rely. And in those different contexts, I think what would be a reasonable rate of trust is going to vary. So yeah, I appreciate that point, definitely.
Thank you. So if I were to disagree with the argument that reasonable people can disagree, no, I'm just kidding.
That'd be irrational.
Actually, what I want is sort of related to what Pascal was talking about, and so variation in economic and cultural context could be accommodated within pretty standard approaches to optimizing behavior. You just say like, oh, well, this is rational because you don't expect the future to arrive, and so forth. But I was wondering if your perspective has broader implications for any attempt to do sort of normative and generalizing, particularly model-based studies in behavioral ecology or economics about optimizing behavior. How radically personal and diverse do you expect it to be? Can we still make these sort of very general expectations and expect them to work, or would you say maybe that's not the right approach?
Well, I think I'm offering a very finely tuned context dependent account. So I don't really see that as threatening. I do appreciate, because I had been focused more on individual differences with respect to value and priorities. And I think you guys have rightfully emphasize the social, cultural variability. So I don't really see that as inconsistent. And I would definitely err on the side of being as flexible as possible with respect to the particularities of these variable circumstances.
Thank you. Very, very instructive. Your description of the Nietzschean person who lives dangerously and the person who wants to just chill out at home, those people tend to marry one another.
Well, good. I still haven't found my spouse.
And in the world of behavioral finance, reasonable people disagreeing very often results in quite heated debate and even divorce. Financial disagreements between different sides of that perspective is one of the key reasons many people divorce.
Right.
And reasonable people can disagree, but building agreement
Consensus.
starts with finding anything where there's a common agreement on the fact, on the truth, and then you can build from there. So
yeah, no, that's helpful. And I just want to make a general point, because we mentioned Plato. He was no fan of democracy, right? He wanted the philosopher king or queen. But for me, a minimum requirement of believing in democracy is this baseline assumption that the vast majority of the population are going to be reasonable, right? Even though there's going to be fundamental divergence, I think if you're basically in a position of pronouncing half the country irrational, you're not really going to consistently be into democracy so much. So I just, like I said, I think this sort of conclusion is very much countervailing to a lot of the common narrative. And I would add that what makes this so challenging, speaking of emotionally laden decision making, which typically is our moral and political judgments, the more emotionally laden a decision is, the more it feels universally right, serious, and inviolable. So we're the least likely to be open-minded when our decision is the most emotional. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind with respect to these divergencies.